Even though these times can feel a little bit crazy, they're not so very different from what other generations have experienced.
So now, everybody welcome to the chat, Political Lana. On April 11th, 2017, Lana Del Rey, known for her more downtrodden, nihilistic, and romantic music and image, released this photo onto Instagram, sending shockwaves through the fandom. We had entered a new era of Lana, donning a beaming smile, flowers in her hair, and a newfound lust for life. 3 months later, Lana's fifth studio album, Lust for Life, was released to the general public to mostly positive reviews. Mostly. Now, don't get me wrong, I really love this album. I think it's really beautiful and I think it has some of Lana's strongest songs, but in the same breath, it's just like undeniably really messy. Its sound is really all over the place, its themes are pretty inconsistent, and its more overt politics are, well, they're certainly present. And aside from being a shift away from her usual sad girl persona, Lust for Life was released in a really pivotal moment in contemporary American history. In my recent video, New Girl and the End of the Quirky White Woman, I discussed the kind of like insane popular media white woman politics of the Hillary Clinton era.
Break it down in 3 words. I'm with her.
A time filled with a bit too much optimism when it came to the state of American politics, which ultimately led to the election of Donald Trump as the 45th President of the United States. And look where we are now. The Democratic Party has kind of been in shambles since the Obama administration, a crazy, crazy time in which white liberals were really like, we have a black president, we don't have any problems anymore.
I would have voted for Obama for a 3rd term if I could.
Within the liberal community, there was definitely this unshakable feeling of safety that was absolutely destroyed upon the election of Trump in 2016. And this feeling of grief was nowhere more present than in the popular media of 2017. A year which was just absolutely saturated with political media of varying levels of effectiveness. We had the feminist rhetoric that we discussed a bit in the New Girl video that was very girl bossy. We had Damn by Kendrick Lamar, we had Get Out, we had Thank You for Your Service, We've Got It From Here by Tribe Called Quest. We had this really insane season of American Horror Story where nothing is supernatural because the real horror is the contemporary American landscape. And what these pieces of media all really had in common were feelings of grief and anxiety for the 4 years to come. And now with Trump being officially reelected as the President of the United States in 2024, it really does feel like we're in some weird time loop, transported back to the political feelings that we were really feeling and seeing in 2016 and 2017. So with that in mind, I thought that today it would be interesting and important to kind of just take a look back, travel back to 2017, and look at the ways in which some popular media was discussing the politics of the time. How did it shape pop culture, and how did pop culture shape our understandings of politics? What can we learn from these pieces of media that we can apply to the present day? And of all the mournful Trump-era popular media of 2017, there was one album that really just stuck out to me like a sore thumb. An album that I legitimately think needs to be studied, and we're going to do that today. The album in question is, well, you already know what it is. It's Lust for Life by Lana Del Rey.
Of the Hollywood sign, yeah.
But before we get into this crazy, crazy album, hi, my name is Emma Chang-Kredl. Welcome back to my channel. It's so lovely to have you here. I just wanted to take a second to once again thank everyone for the immense support I've had on my channel since I started 8 months ago. This has been such a dream for me. I am so happy making these videos. If you want to support the channel in some ways, you can like this video, you can subscribe, you can comment, share the video, check out some of my other videos. And if you're feeling really insane, you can check out my Patreon. But anyway, thank you again for your support. Let's get back to the video. For those of you who live under a rock, Lana Del Rey is an American singer-songwriter who rose to prominence in 2012 with the release of the album Born to Die, followed by her 2014 release Ultraviolence. 2 albums that had sad Tumblr girlies like me in an absolute chokehold. Lana's music has always been marked by a blending of genres like pop, jazz, folk, hip-hop, and rock, to name a few, but has always really conformed, at least in the beginning, to one general aesthetic, being Americana. During some promotional interviews for Lust for Life, Lana stated, quote, "I definitely changed my visuals on my tour videos. I'm not going to have the American flag waving while I'm singing Born to Die. It's not going to happen. I'd rather have static. It's a transitional period, and I'm super aware of that." Even before this interview, before the release of the album, we got a little bit of a taste of Lana's political intentions for this album through this album trailer that she posted to social media a couple months ahead of the album's release.
Because you and the music and this place are my love, my light, my lust for life.
Here we find Lana in a black and white witchy dreamscape, in which she tells fans that she's been living in the H of the Hollywood sign, cooking up her new album. She states that she's needed some time to be reclusive in order to figure out this project amidst the dark political times, before affirming, quote, "So even though these times can feel a bit crazy, they're not so very different from what other generations have experienced at one time or another, before amidst all the uncertainty. And as we transition out of one era to another, there's no place I'd rather be than smack dab in the middle of Hollyweird making this album for you." And while I think that this trailer is really vital to understanding Lana's political intentions throughout this album, I thought it would be kind of a little more fruitful and a little more fun to just like slowly go through the album, kind of unpack some of her lyrics, some motifs, some visuals, and see where we get with that. But what I will point out here is that through this trailer, Lana makes a very clear point to base her discussion of politics in kind of like the cyclical nature of American history.
Climb up the H.
Now, Lust for Life is not just like front to back a completely overtly political album. In fact, I would argue that the first half of the album isn't really that political at all. Instead, Lana takes the time here to introduce us to this new era of Lana, where after a string of 3 rather dark and brooding albums, she's now embracing love and happiness. In a way, it feels like a rebirth, or at the very least, hope for a rebirth. Much like the album cover, finding Lana smiling with flowers in her hair, looking like a love and peace 1960s hippie, the album starts off in a pretty typical Lana fashion, with the Hollywood Baroque pop anthems Love and Lust for Life, which find Lana being in love, climbing up the H of the Hollywood sign, and finding joy and hope amidst a chaotic Hollywood landscape. The song Love and its corresponding music video open up with particularly pertinent discussions and imagery in relation to this idea of historical cycles that we saw in the trailer. In fact, in the very first lines of the album, Lana even states, quote, "Look at you kids with your vintage music, coming through satellites while cruising. You're part of the past, but now you're the future. Signals crossing can get confusing. It's enough just to make you feel crazy, crazy, crazy." Furthermore, the video for Love depicts a juxtaposition between Lana dressed in 60s clothes and makeup, singing, while young hipster-esque Americans in love set out on a journey between the 1960s and a seemingly spacey future, searching for peace and happiness amongst an anxious and overwhelming period, caught between the past and the future. And with these lyrics and visuals, it becomes really clear that Lana seems to be drawing comparisons between the revolutionary politics of the 1960s and the state of politics in 2017. But more so than that, in a pretty typical Lana fashion, her discussion of these issues blends pretty contemporary references with a very heavy-handed dose of nostalgia. Now, up until this point, this wasn't anything particularly new for Lana, as her music and just her general branding has always been marked by this feeling of nostalgia blended with contemporary references. We see this immediately in her debut album Born to Die, with overt references to the 50s in blue jeans and references to the presidential decadency of the JFK era in the 60s. In Ultraviolence, we get some pretty overt references to the 70s in songs like Brooklyn Baby. In a lot of ways, we can see these albums as yearnings for past American decades. One thing that's always really interested me about Lana's aesthetic and music is how unabashedly ahistorical they are, even though they're just like steeped in images of history. And I think that this choice of hers, this vibe that she has, really plays into how her politics come through on this project. But in order to understand how this works, we're gonna have to take a quick second to talk about Postmodernism. In Postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism, Frederic Jameson essentially describes postmodernism as the transformation of the historical past into, quote, a series of emptied out stylizations, unquote, which then are commodified and consumed within a capitalist society. As an example, we can understand the boom of 50s aesthetics in 1980s pop culture as being postmodern, taking the nostalgic qualities and signifiers of a past decade, stripping them of their actual history, and transforming them into easily digestible representations of the past, or a pastiche. Now, what is a pastiche? Well, if we can understand a parody as essentially mimicking a person, situation, or genre in a humorous way with very deliberate exaggerations to style and gestures, pastiche is like essentially this. It has very exaggerated style and it's referential, but it's stripped of its humorous quality. So basically what we're left with is sort of like a hollow reincarnation of an original. In relation to our conversation about postmodernism and nostalgia, we can understand nostalgia-heavy content as being a pastiche of actual eras they're trying to emulate, with really heavy stylization, but lacking actual history. And postmodernism isn't necessarily a bad thing. Its meaning has become super malleable, and it can literally just refer to art, music, film that are meta or referential. For example, films like Pulp Fiction are basically just a bunch of references mashed together to create a new narrative. Postmodernism. But in the case of Lana's music, I would argue that things are a little bit more complex. Lana has always been viewed in pop culture as a complicated figure because of her perceived lack of authenticity. The character of Lana Del Rey, a woman who grew up in trailer parks running free with old bikers, the symbol of Americana, is really nothing more than a fictionalized character, and a lot of people took issue with this. And while I am really not bothered by an artist having a persona, I am just so deeply interested in the ways in which Lana's character exists within the greater American landscape. The figure of Lana Del Rey exists as an amalgamation of different time periods and ideologies. She exists in a place where her truths, her ideologies are seemingly fluid and malleable. She really has no clear truth. She is effectively able to emulate so many different eras and styles all at the same time. The 1950s mob wife, the hippie, the beat poet, the 1970s groupie. All of these characters are true to Lana Del Rey's persona, and all of these characters exist at the same time within the present day. While a Dazed article argued that Lana Del Rey's use of nostalgia was unsuccessful in the Born to Die era because, quote, her aesthetic morphed her into the poster girl for hipster culture gone rogue by embodying what seemed like a give-and-take approach to nostalgia. She wasn't vintage enough. She was too 2012. Too flighty, too non-committal, unquote. I would argue that that is just what really makes Lana Lana. The character of Lana Del Rey is so contemporary, but at the same time, just like a walking, singing pastiche. In a lot of ways, her music just really exists as a truly indulgent escape from the harsh realities of American life. Further, I would suggest that while she's definitely aware of her use of nostalgia in her music, the song Love is the first time in which I really feel like Lana is making overt references to the ways in which nostalgia can kind of mess up one's perception of time and lived experience. Here we can take another look at the opening lyrics of the song with this knowledge of postmodernism. Look at you kids with your vintage music, coming through satellites while cruising. You're part of the past, but now you're the future. Signals crossing can get confusing. It's enough just to make you feel crazy, crazy, crazy. Here, at least to me, there seems to be a sense of self-awareness when it comes to the use of nostalgia and pastiche, and the ways in which these images can confuse one's understanding of history and the present. Furthermore, with this line, I feel like Lana is really drawing attention to the duality of her own music, existing in the past and the present all at the same time. And this is going to be really important when we further discuss the more overt politics of this album. So now, while I'm not going to focus on a lot of the songs on the first half of the album in this video, I thought it would still be kind of fun and important to quickly gloss over them. In the video for Lust for Life, much like the Love video, we see Lana going kind of crazy with the 60s sonic and fashion aesthetics. Songs like Cherry have a classic Lana feel with more nostalgic sounds blended with trap drums. Summer Bummer is one of my favorite songs on this album. I think it's so great. It has a really contemporary sound, more of a straightforward trap beat, as well as features from A$AP Rocky and Playboi Carti, and I think it's just like really fun and sultry and downtrodden, but it doesn't really matter to our discussion today. On the other hand, you have more classic Lana songs like White Mustang, which to me are kind of a return to form to the Born to Die era. But yes, in the first half of this track list, we can really see this amalgamation of different Lana Del Rey characters and different time periods all playing out on the same album. Pretty standard Lana stuff. Then the album takes a really weird turn with the 9th track of the album, Coachella, Woodstock in My Mind.
I was at Coachella, leaning on your shoulder.
A big criticism that people have had for Lust for Life in general is that it is sonically and thematically quite fractured. And this is where I'd argue we really see this split begin. While the whole album has a generally 60s vibe, like we just went over, the second half of the album is notably a lot more folky and overtly inspired by the hippie movement, both lyrically and sonically. Not only does Woodstock Coachella in My Mind serve as a really interesting turning point sonically in the album, but it also sees the introduction of a new character. So now, everybody welcome to the chat, Political Lana. Coachella, Woodstock in My Mind as a song is just like conceptually insane. While I could just like walk you through the narrative of the song myself, I found this Lana quote that I think perfectly summarizes everything, so I'm just gonna read you that instead. I know I walk the line sometimes. I saw the comments that people said about my little Coachella Woodstock in My Mind song. I write that title and I'm like, okay, I know I went there, but I think it's amazing. It's on the nose. It's so on the nose. But some things are just what they are. I'm at Coachella for 3 days, and North Korea is pointing missiles at us. And I'm watching Father John Misty with my best friend, who's his wife. That's literally all I'm saying. It's just like, yeah, I'm a hipster. I know. Got it. That's so awesome. But yes, the lyrics are, like Lana said, very on the nose, with her opening the song stating, quote, I was at Coachella, leaning on your shoulder, watching your husband swing in time. I guess I was in it, 'cause baby, for a minute, it was Woodstock in my mind. In the next morning, they put out the warning. Tensions were rising over country lines. I turned off the music, tried to sit and use it, all of the love that I saw that night. Later, she goes on to question why she's even having these thoughts in a moment like this, before going on to croon that she would give up all of her fame and fortune for a stairway to heaven to have one conversation with God. I'm sure from both Lana's explanation of the song and the lyrics I just read to you, it's not too difficult to understand why many people consider the song to just be like all over the place. It feels like Lana just had like a lot of thoughts and really wanted to put them all together coherently, but that didn't really pan out. And while I am far from the first person to point out that this song is messy, I would like to, right now, formally diagnose the reason why that is. While Lana has been able to really effectively blend past and present aesthetics in her work, it has really just, become her brand. Her nostalgic and oftentimes more aesthetic approach to history doesn't really mesh well when she's trying to have actual nuanced discussions about politics and history. And in order to understand what I mean by this, let's just take a second to talk about Woodstock. Taking place at the tail end of the 1960s, a decade fondly remembered as an era of revolution, we can now understand Woodstock more as a celebration of hippie culture and counterculture as opposed to the actual revolution that took place earlier in the decade, like the civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam War activism, and the sexual revolution, amongst many other political actions. Woodstock, the 4-day festival that took place in August 1969, in many ways became a real turning point in American culture, as it effectively made the counterculture movement mainstream, which ultimately led to the movement's demise in the early 1970s. While the hippie movement that really defined Woodstock was understood as being a political group, much like the album, there was definitely a duality present in hippie ideology of the time. While yes, part of the movement was based in anti-war sentiments and revolution, it was arguably equally about hedonism and spirituality, as understood by Roger Chapman in the United States of Hippies. The counterculture movement also encapsulated other groups like the Black Power movement and the New Left, which were groups that were much more serious about political activism and really viewed hippies as being entitled and hedonistic. We can understand revolution through the perspective of hippies as being much more aesthetic than action-oriented. Woodstock in the present day is understood above anything else as an aesthetic, a hollowed-out representation of the counterculture in the 1960s. Like, when we look back at the 1960s, the average person is thinking about flower crowns, loose flowy dresses, tie-dye, and bare feet, which are now kind of just seen as synonymous with revolutionary politics of the decade. And this space, this kind of like pastiche of the 60s in which we understand Woodstock, is really where Lana Del Rey resides in the song Coachella, Woodstock in My Mind, wishing that the love she felt at Coachella that day could be transformed into hope and peace. But while this is the case, I also, in the same breath, think that Lana is pretty self-aware in the song, which is what makes it so interesting to me. The aftermath of Woodstock caused a huge commodification of festival culture, with festivals quickly becoming what we know them as today. And this is nowhere more clear than at Coachella, a prestige celebrity-studded festival adorned with the aesthetics of the Love Generation. In Coachella, Woodstock in My Mind, Lana understands the irony of her being, like this rich white woman at this really prestigious music festival while there's talks of nuclear war. She's pointing out that Woodstock in many ways is a pastiche of Woodstock, but at the same time, she's using these Woodstock revolutionary aesthetics in such a pastiche way. Aside from the Woodstock of it all, we can also understand that this is an extremely anxious song. It's not unlike her to bring up anxieties about some political issues, especially later in her discography, namely the issue of climate change. If you're interested in hearing about Lana Del Rey and climate change, I do have a video of that from a few months back on my channel. I will link that in the description. Much like the rest of her persona, her discussion of political anxieties are always wrapped up in contemporary cultural references. At the end of The Greatest, off of Norman fucking Rockwell, Lana states, quote, "Hawaii just missed that fireball. LA is on flames, it's getting hot. Kanye West is blonde and gone. Life on Mars ain't just a song." And while I think that her tendency to position contemporary culture and politics in juxtaposition with past culture and politics is a really useful thing to do, the ways in which Lana discusses them end up lacking so much political nuance because her persona and her music is just so baked in this postmodern, nostalgia-heavy lens. And while Lana's whole brand is incorporating this nostalgia and images of Americana into darker, self-reflexive cultural and internal examinations, it doesn't really hit the same here. Through positioning Woodstock in this lens and juxtaposing it with contemporary culture, we miss out on some pretty key context. Namely here, the fact that Woodstock in many ways was a huge turning point in American culture as it saw the mainstreaming of the counterculture movement. And like we talked about before, this really ended up leading to the end of the Revolutionary Era. This is a bit of a generalization, like there was still revolutionary action taking place in the 70s and the counterculture movement was still pretty at large at the beginning of the 1970s, but through the mainstreaming of counterculture, things became kind of less organized, things started to fizzle out a bit more. Entering instead an era marked by political and social anxieties, excess, and indulgence, which was ultimately taken advantage of in the political campaigns of Ronald Reagan, who was set on restoring America to its mythological pre-1960 state. And now, many of those same hippies who stood for revolution in the 60s are the ones who are supporting Trump in the present day. And while it's certainly useful to make connections between different eras, like here the revolutionary politics of the 1960s and the present day, or, the Reagan era and the Trump era, context here is really key. In the postmodern era, when history, in a sense, becomes flattened and understood primarily through myth and aesthetics, it becomes really difficult to map out these political patterns in a nuanced way. And this is something that we're going to dig a little deeper into in another track in just a second. But first, let's quickly touch on the next track on the album, God Bless America and All the Beautiful Women in It. God Bless America and All the Beautiful Women in It is a song that I can only describe as like Lana kind of trying to reclaim the Americana imagery that defined her for so many years prior to this. We're not going to go too deep in the song, but essentially, in my mind, this is the closest thing we get to like a 2017 girl boss era Lana track. But like in the deepest Lana fashion, with her singing, God bless America and all the beautiful women in it. May you stand proud and strong like Lady Liberty shining all night long. And while I genuinely think this is a great song, I really enjoy it, it's kind of undeniable that it's pretty politically hollow and definitely has a bad case of patriotic liberal syndrome, but this is Lana Del Rey, and we wouldn't expect anything less from her. But now let's move on to the next track on the album, which sees a continuation of Lana's connections between Woodstock and contemporary revolution. When the World Was at War Before We Kept Dancing is the closest thing we get to like an actual protest song on Lust for Life. Much like Coachella, Woodstock in my mind, Lana draws parallels, like we just said, between the social unrest of the 1960s and the late 2010s with the presidency of Donald Trump. While Coachella Woodstock in my mind speaks more on her internal reaction to this political unrest, When the World Was at War functions more, in a sense, like a generational anthem, calling for the youth to rise up and keep dancing, much like she recalls the hippie generation did in the 60s. In response to the repetition of her questions, is this the end of an era? Is this the end of America? She suggests, no. It's only the beginning. If we hold on to hope, we'll have a happy ending. When the world was at war before, we just kept dancing, and we'll do it again. In an interview with Flaunt, Lana explains that, quote, in her mind, the lyrics were a reminder not to shut down or shut off, or just not talk about things. It was more like, stay vigilant and keep dancing, stay awake. In this track specifically, I was really interested in Lana's use of the term dance as a metaphor. On one hand here, dance could be interpreted as an analogy for social action, which falls in line with the message of the rest of the song and has been widely understood as Lana's intentions behind the track. On the other hand here, I think we can argue that the idea of dance can be interpreted as more of like a Woodstock-esque excessiveness. And the thing here is that through Lana's use of these revolutionary 1960s aesthetics, both interpretations kind of play out at the same time. Here, revolution and excess seemingly become one, which definitely speaks to the duality of the counterculture movement in the 1960s. In my opinion, Woodstock, the age of Aquarius, flooded with images of love and peace, exists, to me at least, as the liberal alternative to Trump and Reagan's portrait of the 1950s. Both of these guys utilized a hyper-nostalgic lens to create this perfect portrait of a conservative, family values-based American society, a utopia which never really truly existed, and if it did, functioned off of bigotry and hate, but nevertheless an America that we should return to. And what's so interesting to me is the intersection of these two American utopias are so present in Lana's discography. While we can and should learn from history, there's a big difference between like actual history and this mythicized history. While sure, we can enter Lana's American utopia as kind of like a mental escape, these are not like real factual places. And because of that, these aren't solutions that make that much sense. But while Lana's protest song here kind of falls flat because of her, well, flattening of history, let's now take a moment to connect these ideas to the 15th track on the album, Change. Change is another track in which Lana really attempts to blend the personal with the political, with Lana singing quite open-endedly about the idea of change. In a way, the song does have like a similar feeling of complacency that Woodstock Coachella in My Mind had. In that song, she sings, "Maybe my contribution can be as small as hoping." In Change, Lana sings, "There's a change gonna come, I don't know where or when, but whenever it does, we'll be here for it." And much like Coachella, Woodstock in My Mind, and When the World Was at War before, this song moves really weirdly between different fears, like her fear of nuclear war and wanting to see change in that, and then fearing that she won't be a good enough partner, wanting to change to be a better lover. And this I don't find to be particularly effective, I will say. But that being said, I do genuinely think that there's some genuine value that can be extracted from the song. I'm thinking here of one specific line that she sings, stating, "Every time that we run, we don't know where it's from. Now we finally slow down, we feel close to it." Even though we've discussed the ways in which Lana repeatedly compares the 1960s to the 2010s, one thing that we haven't discussed is one of the biggest differences between the 1960s and the 10s, which is the fact that things are just moving way faster now than they were back then, especially with rapid developments we've seen in technology and social media. It's easy to say that we're re-entering a period like the 1960s because of the comparisons we can make between the states of political unrest, but contextually speaking, these are very, very different times. The 2010s and 2020s are just like a techno-capitalist landscape where there's just so much turnaround when it comes to news stories, trends, and information that it's so rare that there's like moments where we all have our eyes on the same issue. For example, we can look back at the early COVID-19 pandemic, a time that was marked by a lot of stillness. And in this stillness caused a lot more eyes to be on the Black Lives Matter movement, and the movement gained a lot of momentum because of this. And from this, we can glean that there's definitely something to be said about slowing down. But at the same time here, and just in general, I think that Lana walks a very thin line between this idea of stillness and just like stagnancy. In this one interview, Lana states, quote, "I think there was a great period of not being sure what was going on. I was there when Obama got elected in Union Square. Under that administration, it felt like a dream had come true-ish. And we could focus on arts, and it was a time of reprieve, and we didn't have to talk about certain things. But of course, there was a lot going on," unquote, an admission of feeling comfort within a period of which people were tired after the presidency of George Bush and the War on Terror, a time in which she felt comfortable focusing mostly on her interior. And I think that this quote is very eye-opening when, one, thinking about Lana's position of privilege within the political landscape of not really having to care about politics because she felt so safe under the Obama administration. Secondly, I feel like this quote really puts Lana's more flattened understanding of history into context and teaches us valuable lessons about cycles of complacency. After a really rough 2000s under the presidency of George Bush, people were just happy to let the Obama administration do their thing. And in turn, we're willing to really just like turn a blind eye to a lot of harmful immigration and surveillance measures being put in place. And remembering these times of complacency is just as important as remembering times of revolution, because it's so clear that this is such a cyclical issue within American history. In the exhaustion of post-Vietnam War, post-revolution, post-Watergate America in the 1970s, many Americans were left just like disillusioned. While many changes were made in this era, socially and politically speaking, for the most part, there was still a lot of work left to do. And this work was just like generally discarded by the larger public, which included the hippie movement. It's important to learn from this era that we have to conserve energy, not fall into pitfalls of excess, and ultimately just like not burn out. In this era where we're just constantly moving so fast and being flooded with images and ideas of pastiche, it is really so important to just take a second to like sit down and untangle these histories as a means to shed light on a lot of these harmful cycles and patterns that we're seeing, which can ultimately lead to real meaningful change. Now, finally, the album closes out with what I would consider to be, honestly, one of Lana's greatest songs, being Get Free. A beautiful song that takes on the form of a hero's journey, with Lana, referencing Neil Young, moving out of the black into the blue. In the chorus, Lana sings, quote, "Sometimes it feels like I got a war in my mind. I want to get off, but I keep riding the ride. I never really noticed that I had to decide to play someone's game or live my own life, and now I do. I want to move out of the black into the blue." And for me, this is my sobriety song. It really makes me feel empowered to move past the need to fill voids with excess. But like I said before, there are just so many different interpretations, and I think that's beautiful. From a more objective standpoint, Lana has stated that this song is about Amy Winehouse and Whitney Houston and other artists who were tragically lost to the dance. Here being a reference to fame, to being controlled and getting caught up with a lot of substances. Lana states that this song is, quote, "my commitment, my modern manifesto. I'm doing it for all of us that never got the chance, for all my birds of paradise who never got to fly at night because they were caught up in the dance." And once again here, we come back to this paradox of dance, with dance here being very clearly interpreted as being like about the whirlwind of fame as opposed to being a form of political resistance. But as we get this interpretation at the end of the album, we can begin to understand this duality of dance as almost like a cautionary tale. The idea of dance is something that needs to be navigated here for the youth that is part of the past, now the future, confused by signals crossing. While dance can metaphorically and literally be a radical form of protest, of embracing hope and change, it's equally important to not lose yourself within cultural excess. The mythicized idea of hope and change as understood by the pretty much failed hippie movement. So with Get Free wrapping up the album, what can we take away from Lust for Life? Lana is definitely a complex and controversial figure, something that we can definitely take away from this album listening experience. In the Woodstock conservatism of Lana Del Rey, Kumar Salehi criticizes Lana's political turn on Lust for Life, writing, quote, "Her most recent album, Lust for Life, announces Lana's arrival in a wax museum of late 60s counterculture, in some instances trading reactionary, solipsistic despair for a vague liberal concern. The more upbeat, almost triumphal melodies and numerous ham-fisted stabs at social commentary confirm our image of a revisionist Lana, no longer willing to sneer and give the finger to the idea of social responsibility, nor to present her music exclusively through the filter of her tortured interiority," unquote. I definitely think this is valid criticism, especially given just like the oversaturation of really ham-fisted liberal music being released that year. Also, I would agree that this is by no means a revolutionary leftist political album. It is very much a self-interested piece. But all that being said, I don't think her goal with this project was necessarily to just like spew a bunch of lived up talking points. Instead, I see this project more as Lana kind of taking a step back and really understanding her place in the contemporary American landscape and the contemporary American political landscape. Something that I would argue is in the same breath useful and selfish. Unlike a lot of the white liberal media that we talked about in my last video, which again are just like regurgitating a lot of these girl boss ideologies, Lana's lens here, in my opinion, might actually be more useful when it comes to like actually starting political discussions because of its strangeness, because it really exists like a puzzle that doesn't exactly fit together. It's just like begging to be dissected and put back together. The mere fact that it is so different from so much of the other political pop records of the time offers us such a unique understanding of American politics as they intertwine with postmodern imagery and discourse, and I think that's kind of special. While Lust for Life is far from a perfect album, through its inherent duality, perhaps we can grasp that in order to understand what we want change to look like in the 2020s, we first do have to look inwards in order to understand our place within the cultural and political landscape. While it's been an increasingly tiresome decade and there's been so much going on and such an increased need for social action, it's so important for us, those who are part of the past but now the future, to take the time to slow down, to create community, to organize, to sustain energy, maintain momentum, break cycles, and to get free. And that's going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much if you stuck around till this point. I hope you got something out of this. This was a really fun and challenging video to make, but yeah, I think it worked. If you want to help support the channel in any way, you can give me a like, subscribe, comment, share, check out my Patreon. Also, thank you so much to my patrons, listing their names right here. But until the next time, thank you so much for being here. Love you.